Walking the line, I woke in a standing position, my eyes suddenly shooting open and my legs weakening as I began to stumble. I panicked as I felt myself falling forward, instinctively reaching out to grab the nearest thing to hand, which happened to be the shirt of the guy standing in front of me. "Watch it, buddy," he exclaimed in annoyance, although the mystery man did take hold of my arm and shoulder before helping me to steady myself. "Are you okay?" he asked sympathetically. "Yeah, I think so," I replied through trembling lips, as I tried to get my bearings. "Well, just keep your cool," he instructed, "and, whatever you do, don't step over the white lines." I didn't understand what he meant, but then I adjusted my eyes and surveyed the scene around me, and what I saw was a vision of hell. I hadn't seen the face of the man who'd helped me, but when I looked up, I could make out the back of his head in the darkness and realize he'd turned around after assisting me, now facing forwards. Darkness was all around me, but there was a dim illumination on the ground which I stood upon. Two lines of white light about 3 feet apart, one to the left of me, and the other on my right. I remembered what the man had told me a moment earlier, warning me not to step outside of these lines. I didn't know what he meant, but somehow realized this was probably good advice. I creaked my head to one side, looking over the shoulder of the man ahead and seeing a line of people standing in front of him, a long, single-file queue of shadowy figures stretching for several hundred yards up what appeared to be a slight elevation. All stood within the two white lines which seemed to operate like some kind of emergency lighting, and at the top of the queue of unidentified figures was a doorway of bright, almost blinding light, a literal beacon in a sea of darkness, inviting, comforting, and offering a glimmer of hope in what otherwise seemed like a dangerous situation. I didn't understand what this place was or why I was here, but in that moment, I believed the shining white light ahead was my salvation. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of people standing in the queue in front of me, and I couldn't move past them without stepping outside of the white lines. I shook my head, experiencing an almost crippling anxiety as my mind raced to make sense of this inexplicable situation. I opened my dry lips and struggled to speak, addressing my fearful question to the anonymous man in front of me. What is this place? How did we get here?" He didn't turn his head to face me, but the man did respond. "You see the white light at the front of the line?" he asked in a surprisingly calm voice. "Yes," I confirmed nervously. "Well, look behind you," he instructed. I was terrified but needed to know the truth, and so I turned my head, making sure to keep my footing and stay within the lines as I did so. Directly behind me stood a woman about 5'5" tall. I could barely make out her features in the dark, but, in any case, her head was down, and it appeared she was unconscious. She was sleeping while standing up, just as I had been only moments before. I guess this was the same for every person in the line, and that we'd all been unconscious when they brought us here. But who had done this to us, and why? I decided this was a question for later. I suppose I should have paid more attention to the sleeping woman behind me, and if I'd done so I would surely have recognized the young lady, but my attention was drawn to the scene beyond her. I soon realized I was standing in the middle of a long queue which stretched back for at least several hundred yards and sloped downwards, and at its end was the polar opposite to the light before me. At the very bottom of the line was a swirling vortex of crimson red, a terrifying portal to God knows where, so vile and sinister that I couldn't bear to look upon it for more than a few seconds. If the light before us offered hope and salvation, the blood-red whirlpool surely represented doom and despair, and the mere sight of it chilled me to my very bones. I turned back around, muttering a profanity under my breath as my body shook. "It gets worse," the man in front said ominously. "Look ahead." I creaked my head once again and saw a terrifying scene unfolding. I guess another man had suddenly woken up like I had, but he didn't react well to his surroundings. I watched in awestruck horror as the darkened figure stumbled, swearing as he put his foot forward and stepped outside of the white lines. Someone else in the queue tried to stop him, reaching out to grab the disorientated man whilst shouting, "Don't do it, man. We can't leave the queue, no matter what." But the well-meaning person's efforts were in vain as the man he was trying to save ignored the warning, slapping his hand away whilst shouting, "Get away from me, you damn freak." And then he put both feet across the line on his right-hand side and walked out into the darkness. I say dark, but I could still make out his shape once he was over the line. He was a big guy, over 6 foot in height and well-built. I guess he didn't scare easy and thought he could find a way out, but he didn't get far. I guess he was about 10 yards out before they got him. Thankfully, I couldn't see much in the dim light, and it all happened so fast. but the creatures that emerged from the black void were horrifying, imp-like demons the size of grown men, but with eyes which burned a deadly shade of red, and with claws and teeth like those of the deadliest predators. There were 3 monsters in total, and they all roared like lions, moving so rapidly as they surrounded the doomed man and tore at him with their long and sharp claws. Their victim screamed in absolute terror as the monsters ripped his clothes and skin. Next, the horrified man tried to fight and make his way back to the relative safety of the queue, but soon he was knocked over and seriously wounded by a deep slash along his back. Even then he didn't give in, crawling along the hard ground as he desperately cried for help. Not one person attempted to reach him, however, as all remained frozen to their spots, and of course, he didn't make it. A moment later, one of the demons grabbed him by the legs, pulling his body away from the line as he screamed and tried in vain to dig his nails into the ground. Before long, the monsters and their victim disappeared into the darkness. We could no longer see them, but we did hear the vicious attack reaching its horrifying conclusion. The doomed man screamed louder as his predatory attackers growled sadistically, and then I heard the appalling sounds of skin ripping, bones cracking, and finally what I can only assume was the noise of the monsters feasting on his still warm flesh. What the fuck? I swore aloud. I retched, feeling like I was going to be sick, but nothing came up. Panic soon spread along the entire line as people reacted to the vicious killing we'd all just witnessed. Some deteriorated into screaming hysterics whilst others fell into themselves, whimpering or quietly praying under their breath. But all were in agreement on one point: we must not step outside of the white lines. Stepping out of the queue meant certain death. Well, within the lines we were safe, for now at least. I shivered as I tried to come to terms with the extreme violence I'd just seen. It seemed like the temperature had suddenly dropped, or perhaps this was just my brain's perception. In any event, my mind was now racing, and I wanted to ask 100 questions at once. I noticed how the man in front of me had hardly reacted to the savage attack. It was like he'd expected it to happen. I also recalled how he'd helped me when I first woke up, but I was still to see his face, and even now he would not turn around. He'd been the one who'd warned me about the rules, and that simple advice had probably saved my life. Nevertheless, I had the distinct feeling that his faceless man knew more about our situation than he'd shared thus far, and so I was determined to ask him further questions. But before I got the chance, I was disturbed by a soft cry from behind me. I jumped in shock and turned around, almost accidentally putting my right foot over the line before I stopped myself. Once I turned, I saw the woman behind me slowly falling, and I reached out to catch her, taking hold of her slender body and helping her back up to her feet. I felt a familiarity as I held her in my arms. Perhaps it was her scent, or maybe my muscle memory. But then she lifted her head and met my eye, and I almost jumped out of my skin once I saw her face. "Sally," I said in astonishment, as if my eyes were deceiving me. "Joshua," she answered weakly, as she opened her eyes and slowly adjusted to our new environment. I saw her dark hair tied back in a bun, her soft skin and expressive green eyes, and knew it was indeed her. And Sally's presence in this hellish realm brought the terror I felt to a whole new level. I held onto Sally's body as she regained her composure, and continued to do so until she was able to stand on her own 2 feet. And I was still thinking of what to say as I looked into her frightened eyes, and a flood of old emotions came back to me, some good, others bad. In the end, I could only repeat the crucial advice I'd been given, saying, "Don't step outside of the lines, Sally. Whatever you do, stay inside the lines." Sally looked up at me in confusion, and I was prepared for a stream of follow-up questions which I likely couldn't answer. But before we got the chance to speak, the man in front of me spoke, asking, "Did the 2 of you know each other?" Yeah, I answered without thinking. "Sally and I used to date." Interesting," the man replied without elaborating. He was still facing forward and so couldn't have seen Sally falling into my arms. He must have been reacting to the sound of our voices and eavesdropping on our conversation. Meanwhile, Sally adjusted to our terrifying situation, looking ahead at the light and back towards the vortex. Her reaction was much the same as mine, as I saw her face contort with horror and confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, looking to me for answers. "That's what I'm trying to find out," I replied, before turning back towards the man in front. "Hey buddy," I said, "you know our names. How about you tell us yours?" The man still refused to turn his head, and he didn't speak for a long time. But finally, he did answer my question, saying, "You can call me Milo." "Okay," I replied hesitantly. The name rang a bell somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't dwell on it. Well, Milo, how about you tell us what the hell is going on? I demanded. What makes you think I know anything? He replied cryptically. I think you know more than you're letting on, I said. You told me about the lines after all. Fair enough, Milo admitted. I know some things, but not everything. He paused before continuing. You wake up in this queue, standing between the white lines. You know what happens when you step outside of them. Sally didn't, not yet anyway. I was grateful she'd been spared the sight of the savage killing. What are those things out there? I asked, although a part of me didn't want to know the answer. Milo shrugged his shoulders but still didn't turn around. Can't say for sure, he said. They could be demons, monsters, aliens, or genetic mutations. In the end, it doesn't really matter, does it? I know they dwell in the darkness all around us, and they see everything. For whatever reason, they can't step inside of the lines. We're safe from them as long as we stay in the queue. But if we enter their domain, they'll slaughter us without hesitation. I turned to Sally, seeing the fear in her eyes. That's a look I hadn't seen in a long time and hoped I would never witness again. I put a hand around my ex's shoulder to comfort her, but she pushed me away, and I was forced to remember why we'd broken up in the first place. I put this to the back of my mind, however, instead focusing on my inquisition of the faceless man in front. So, we're trapped here? I asked fearfully, the desperation now evident in my voice. Oh no, Milo answered in an almost flippant tone. I'm afraid you don't understand. The queue won't remain stationary. When the trumpets blow, we move forward, one at a time. When the trumpets blow, what the hell did that mean? I thought about it for a moment before I realized the implications of what Milo was saying. You mean we move towards the light? I asked hopefully. I knew little about our situation, but surely the white light at the top of the queue was our chance at salvation. Yeah, that's what happens, but there's a catch, Milo said. What do you mean? I demanded in angry frustration. You'll find out soon enough, was Milo's typically evasive response. I opened my mouth to speak again, but then I heard it. The trumpets, blaring from God knows where, a deafening and terrifying sound which blasted out from the darkness, seemingly surrounding us on all sides. Both Sally and I collapsed down to our knees, covering our ears with our hands in a futile effort to drown out the awful din. I felt the pressure building inside of my skull and thought my head was going to explode, but thankfully the trumpet stopped after a few moments, and then the line started to move. I looked forward and saw the figure at the front of the queue stepping into the light, his dark silhouette immersed as he raised his arms and cried out in glorious ecstasy, gladly allowing the portal to transport him to another realm. And with that, he was gone, freed from this nightmare and surely now safe from the monsters which dwelt within this dark hellscape. Wow. I expressed in amazement, but, like Milo had warned us, there was a catch. Suddenly we heard a blood-curdling scream from behind us, the cry of abject terror emitted by somebody in mortal danger. I swiftly turned my neck, seeing how Sally was already facing in that direction. My eyes widened in terror as I saw the man at the back of the line, his body being physically sucked into the swirling vortex of crimson red. He continued to scream as his legs were pulled inside, and soon he was up to his waist, reaching out desperately and digging his nails into the frozen dirt beneath him. Please, please help me, he cried. There was a woman ahead of him in the line and, to her credit, she did try to help. Reaching down, she grabbed his hand tightly, but the pull of the hellish vortex was too great. Within minutes she lost her grip upon him and the man was sucked through the portal. I remember the look on his face the second before he disappeared into the abyss, his eyes so wide and his mouth frozen in a silent scream, and then he was gone. The middle-aged, slightly overweight woman who tried to save him suddenly cried out, as something inside of her just broke. I can't do this. I can't be here, she exclaimed. And, before anybody got the chance to stop her, the frightened woman did the worst thing imaginable. She stepped over the white line. There was nothing we could do but watch as the poor woman attempted to run into the darkness. Inevitably, she didn't make it far. The attack didn't play out like the previous time. She wasn't set upon by a gang of savage monsters, but instead confronted by a single creature which suddenly emerged from the black abyss to block her path. The woman just froze, stopping dead in her tracks as she stared into the monster's burning red eyes. She was seemingly unable to flee or fight, as if the beast had her under its terrible spell. My jaw dropped as I observed the unreal scene. For a moment I naively thought she might be okay and that the monster would actually let her live. But then, In a single rapid and brutal action, the beast raised its muscular arm and thrashed out with its claw, easily cutting the woman's jugular wide open. She grabbed at her throat as blood poured from the gaping wound and soon collapsed heavily to the floor. Her body continued to thrash as she choked on her own blood, but a moment later, the beast leaned down and grabbed hold of her hair, dragging the slowly dying woman into the darkness. "Oh my God," Sally cursed under her breath, and I couldn't utter a word. This was the second person I'd seen slaughtered by the monsters stalking the shadows, but it didn't get any easier. Frightened murmurs and the occasional scream went along the line as all present reacted to the horrors we'd just witnessed. Those who hadn't seen the deaths firsthand no doubt heard about them from their neighbors in the line, and the panic spread like wildfire. Still, I noted how Milo had not reacted at all to the bloodshed. Still, I reckoned he must have eyes on the back of his head, and perhaps he'd seen it all before. Nevertheless, our mysterious companion was able to provide an explanation of sorts. "That's the catch I was telling you about. They let one person pass into the light whenever the trumpets sound, but there's a price to pay. One goes into the light, and the vortex takes one from the back of the line. That's the way it works." Suddenly I felt cold all over. I was sure the temperature had dropped since I first regained consciousness, although this was the least of my worries as my exhausted brain attempted to process what Milo had just told us. I'm sure Sally was doing the same, as she remained silent for the time being. Although I could hear her clicking her tongue, a habit she did when nervous or stressed. I glanced ahead and behind me, once again confirming that we stood roughly in the middle of the long, single-file queue of people. If what Milo said was correct, one person would reach salvation at each trumpet blow, while one would simultaneously be sucked into oblivion, or whatever the hell lay on the far side of that damn portal. Assuming this twisted process continued, the line would gradually grow shorter as more people left this shadowland, and in the end, we would discover our fate. I felt a vile sickness in the pit of my stomach as my whole body shook. I didn't know what to say next, but it was Sally who broke the silence. "Hey Milo, that's your name, right?" She shouted over my shoulder. I saw Milo nodding in confirmation, but he still wouldn't turn to face us. "You know, you still haven't answered Joshua's question. You didn't tell us where we are and why we are here." Milo snorted before replying. "Like I said, I don't know everything, but I guess I've been conscious to our situation for longer than the two of you. During that time, I've come up with a couple of theories, like what Sally demanded." I could tell she was becoming increasingly impatient. We'd been split up for 2 years at this point and hadn't spoken in nearly as long. But seeing her again in this dangerous and terrifying situation made me realize I still had feelings for her. Milo eventually replied in a matter-of-fact tone, with no emotion evident in his voice as he spoke. "Well, one possibility is that we've been kidnapped or abducted by some malicious person or persons." "What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" I tried to think, realizing there was an unexplained gap in my memory. "I remember driving," I said uncertainly, and then everything went black. This didn't make sense. Had I been in an accident? If so, why didn't I recall a crash or collision? I have the same memory," Sally muttered nervously. I glanced back at her in confusion, only to find she wouldn't meet my eye. This revelation confused me even more. Sally and I hadn't been together. We hadn't even seen each other in 2 years. What were the odds of us both being involved in car accidents at the exact same time? And all this talk reminded me of the incident which had led to our breakup in the first place. I'm sure Sally was thinking the same thing, but we'd both promised to never speak of that night again. So, if we were abducted, then who has us? Sally continued, "And why are they doing this to us?" "That's the $1 million question," Milo replied. "It could be aliens, I reckon. Or maybe it's the government running a psychological experiment, or some sick billionaire who tortures people for fun. But of course, there is another possibility, one which is more supernatural in origin." I stared at the back of Milo's head in astonishment, irritated that I couldn't see his face and tell whether he was serious or not. There was a tense pause while I waited for Milo to elaborate, but to my surprise, it was Sally who spoke up next. "You mean that we're dead," she said ominously, "that every person in the line is deceased and trapped between heaven and hell." Her chilling words hung in the air as we considered the terrifying inference. "It's a possibility that's occurred to me," Milo responded dispassionately, breathing life into the horrific theory. "So, if we really are dead," Sally continued, "the white light means salvation while the whirlpool means eternal damnation. Milo didn't answer her question, but the conclusion Sally had come to seem like an obvious one. Still, there was something which I just couldn't understand. But the people at the front of the line are guaranteed to reach salvation, while those at the rear will surely get sucked into hell. I exclaimed, "Why are some saved, and others doomed?" I waited for an answer, but a moment later and the trumpet sounded once again, forcing us to cover our ears and making further conversation impossible. And of course, the whole ritual played out again, as a solitary figure gladly walked into the light while the poor sap at the rear was pulled into the whirlpool, screaming in abject horror as the vortex took him. The line had become slightly shorter, and it was now clear to everyone standing in the queue what was going on here. The fear in the icy cold air was palpable, and soon the line behind us descended into panic and chaos. I heard shouts and screams, looking back over my shoulder to see violent scuffles breaking out, as desperate souls tried to fight their way forward and put as much distance as possible between themselves and the vortex. The results were tragically inevitable. The white lines were only 3 feet apart at most. If people had been more cooperative, they could have slipped past one another and reorganized the line in a sensible manner. But nobody wanted to be left at the back of the queue when the dust settled, and so fights broke out. Desperate struggles which resulted in several people being thrown over the lines on either side. And of course, the monsters were there waiting. A dozen or more demons emerged from the shadows, roaring with fury as their red eyes burned with an intense hunger. The scene which followed was worse than anything we'd seen thus far, as ravenous monsters greedily tore into their near-helpless victims with claws and teeth. I couldn't bear to watch and so turned around, but I could still hear the screams and the awful sounds of ripping and tearing.